Hello and welcome. I'm so that you are joining us today for this, our second professional seminar for supporting multilingual learners of English. This seminar was developed by WestEd and is supported by a grant from Essentia. We would also like to thank our partners, the Texas Success Center, Student Ready Strategies, and SESI. My name is Emily Suh. I'll be facilitating our seminar today about unpacking assumptions, responding to multilingual readers in the writing classroom. Although I currently coordinate an integrated reading and writing program at Texas State University, I spent nearly the first decade of my teaching career in ESL and developmental literacy classes at the community college level. As such, I'm very excited to join you today for our session. This recorded seminar is accompanied by a discussion guide that includes resources as well as additional discussion prompts. Whether you're watching the video on your own or with colleagues, we encourage you to follow along in the guide. At several points during the seminar, I'll also invite you to pause and reflect. These are moments that will offer guided questions to facilitate your individual or group reflection and discussion about the material that we've covered. I'm so glad that you're joining us. Objectives for this professional learning module. Today, participants will consider their own identities, the identities of their students, and how students' identities and linguistic backgrounds are assets to be leveraged in the classroom. Braid research and practice on literacy practices to design assignments that help students learn about their college context while building their academic literacies. And finally, connect their classes to existing services on their campus to support students with holistic support. Although our presenters will introduce themselves in just a moment, I wanted to take a minute to give you a brief bio about today's speakers. Dr. Brett Griffiths teaches reading and writing, as well as creative writing, advanced composition, and qualitative methods. Her research focuses on two-year college literacy studies, as well as faculty professional identity and trauma-informed pedagogies. She's also the former director of the Macomb Reading and Writing Center. Dr. Griffiths has 25 years' experience teaching and facilitating professional development experiences at access-oriented and other institutions. Dr. Charissa is also currently teaching at John Jay College, but she previously taught in the two-year college system in CUNY. She has taught at the Accelerated Learning Program, or ALP, first-year writing, as well as Asian American literature. Dr. Chi's research focuses on multilingual student pedagogy, cultural rhetorics, and translingual pedagogy, as well as multilingual student writing placement. Dr. Chi is the former TICA National Conference Chair, as well as the TICA Associate Chair, and she currently serves as book review editor for Teaching English in the Two-Year College, as well as the journal's incoming co-editor.
As we go forward, Charissa and I do have some goals for all of us listed in our agenda. And I just want to say to start out with that we are both researchers and practitioners. We recognize that all of you joining today, whether you're doing this as a professional development workshop in your department or on your own, bring a set of strategies for teaching literacy, reading, and writing and English language learners in the classroom. And so, what we hope is that you'll start with some of your own experiences as a teacher, but also as a reader and a writer to this conversation, similar to the way that Dr. Dolan and Dr. Jensen spoke about in the last module. We know that you wear many hats and that you really are doing transdisciplinary work that extends from linguistic work to literacy work to student success and other kind of work. As I think Darren Jensen said, sometimes he teaches a first year writing course and then walks a student over to counseling. So we know that you're wearing a lot of those hats. What we hope that this presentation will reinforce is that you're already doing a lot of the things that we want to do, and your practice is probably already informed by research. And then we just want to build on that and maybe give you a couple of extra tools for the classroom. So we'll start today with experience. We'll name and explore our own experiences of and assumptions about the reading experiences of multilingual learners in ESOL and co-requisite classrooms. We'll bring in some research and draw on recommendations from a family of research, transdisciplinary research in writing, literacy, and language studies to literacy instruction in the co-requisite ESOL classroom. Now, a little bit different from the last module, we won't always refer you to directly to the research. We'll often be talking about the research as practice, how we're actually using it in the classroom, and then we might refer outward to the research or provide those resources to read more in the study guide. We'll talk about practice. So, the second half of this presentation, we're going to look at a specific text and some of the ways we might scaffold the reading of that text in a classroom. So, we'll model pre reading, reading, and annotation, as well as some metacognitive reflection as the interconnected phases of what we call reading to learn and apply new knowledge. We'll be inviting you then to go along with us in those models and then to start designing or maybe revising your own assignments. So we'll invite you to draw on this understanding to update and implement reading activities for your ESOL and co-requisite classroom.
At this point, we invite you to pause and reflect before beginning the rest of this module. First, we ask you to consider what are your own experiences reading or writing for academic purposes in a language other than your home language. You and your group, or you individually, might also consider the question, what do you imagine are the most challenging aspects of college level reading for a multilingual learner new to college? Additionally, what strategies do you apply to your own reading when faced with a text in an unfamiliar genre or content area? As a final question to consider, which of these do you model or embed in your classrooms already? When you're done discussing with your group or reflecting on your own, we invite you to continue the recording and learn away.
So when we talk about reading, we want to be thinking of reading as a layered, interactive, and social process. They can only be understood in the context of social, cultural, political, historical, and economic realities. This is a quote and definition that comes from New Literacies from Lancashire and Noble in 2006 and 2011. And I include it because even though it's a little bit old, what it is it's really referring to the social turn, which affected linguistics, reading, and writing across many of our interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary fields. The social turn really had us focus on the ways that reading is not only a cognitive process, it's not just between the eyes and the brain, but also it interacts with who we are as people and what our culture values or what the various overlapping cultures that we may represent may value. We want to start for a moment really thinking about how we read outside of our comfort zone. In many ways, this is what we're asking our students to do when they come into the classroom for the first time or where they're coming in and reading documents in a different language from their home or first or second language. If you go to the study guide, you'll find a copy of this document, which I'll open up for you in just a moment. As you go there, what I want you to think about is how does this text compare with what you regularly read? How does it compare in terms of the genres you usually read, the disciplines you're familiar with? How does it compare in terms of content or length or vocabulary? How is it using images? And if you were handed this document and asked to read it, say, for homework, which we're not going to ask you to do, I promise, what strategies do you think you would bring to try to decode it?
Pause the video and open the document titled Urias et al. 2024, which can be found at the end of the participant handout or in the online ancillary materials for this module. Once participants have located the document, proceed with the video.
Let's take a closer look at the document now. What we have is a document, it's an original article, it appears in some sort of a scientific journal, and it says PNPLA3 risk allele is associated with risk of hepatocellular carcinoma, but not decompensation in compensated cirrhosis. We have a whole host of authors here, I think 10. We get an abstract with backgrounds, methods, and results. And there's a lot of different subheadings through here with subheadings of methods that are broken down into ethics, cohort, genotyping, liver phenotypes, and then an outcome section, baseline characteristics, effects of PNPLA3 on hepatic decompensation, HCC, and liver related mortality and liver transplant. Now, maybe you don't know what PNPLA3 is. I don't either. But if you think for a minute, what kinds of tools would you want to bring to a document that looks like this? Now that you've spent a little bit of time with that document and perhaps found it as uncomfortable to read as I found it uncomfortable to read, I want to introduce you to a quote that I heard at CRLA in 2016. Rachel Liberatore, during a presentation, said struggling readers read text the same way. Confident readers read text in different ways. This quote really struck me. It struck me so much that I wrote it down in my journal and on my phone. At that point in my career, I had been teaching reading in a variety of different ways, mostly through a writing studies lens. But when my students struggled to read, and I felt like I was bringing in all the strategies I knew how to bring them, there was something that was missing in that connection for them. And then it hit me. Most of my students were reading text the way they had been taught to read novels in their English classes, which means I hadn't really broken down the ways that we read different things in different ways. How reading social media is different from reading an anatomy textbook. And that's really where I want to focus as we move forward to how we introduce our multilingual readers to different ways of reading in the academic environment. Specifically, we'll look at integrated reading and writing, what you call INRW in Texas, which, as we know, is explicit curricular instruction on the interconnectedness of reading and writing. I emphasize explicit because we often assume that there's that connection, but we don't necessarily explicitly teach it. It refers to the direct teaching of reading strategies within the writing classroom. And while it is sometimes associated with accelerated learning programs and is a part of some of those programs, it is not the same as. So we need to be talking about the explicit teaching of reading if we want to call it an integrated reading and writing program within the ALP framework. So earlier I mentioned that there's this social turn. So prior to the social turn of the 90s and the aughts, we really thought about reading as something that was purely cognitive. We teach students to sound out words, to make meanings out of those words, and then that process goes into their brains and they make the sense in their brains. But we now, since the social turn, we really are thinking a lot more about the context. What is the background that our students come from? What's their literary culture and community? Do they come from a home that values reading? Do they come from a home that reads for information, such as the newspaper? Do they come from a home that reads to analyze and have debates at dinner? When we think about teaching, we're thinking about modeling collaborative meaning making. So when Dr. Jensen and Dr. Dolan spoke about scaffolding, we're thinking of the same sort of strategy for reading. How do we scaffold that reading by giving students multiple stages and steps towards understanding a larger text? Whereas we may not think of multiple drafts for reading, we certainly do have multiple reads for reading at different levels before we achieve something like meaning. Those strategies include pre-reading, reading, annotating, and responding. And then as we scaffold those processes for students, just like in writing and the writing process, we're hoping those students will be able to transfer those skills to other classrooms. The ability to transfer those skills depends highly on metacognitive reflection. Here, and I know this is a really difficult graphic to look at, and so we've included it in your study guide. What I've been trying to do with this visual is to think about all the different fields that have been informing reading. There are some that are noticeably absent, like critical pedagogy, that I've kind of assumed is buried in here because I can't add any more and make it readable at all. But what I want you looking at here is that these are many of the fields that I've been thinking about reading and writing and the interconnectedness of reading and writing. I use the term reading ecologies to describe this graph. An ecology refers to an interactive relationship between systems and surroundings. By viewing reading instruction as a form of pedagogical eclecticism, we can draw on the many kinds of meaning making afforded by reading across pedagogical theories and learning applications. So, as I look at this from the top, this green area here, generic reading and writing, refers to some of the basic practices we bring to reading uh, at the most basic level as we teach students to decode sounds and words and how do we move through pages of a book. But at the academic and college level, we're really thinking about helping them to understand the differences between texts, How do I read the chapter in an anatomy book differently than a chapter in a Victorian novel or a poem or a press release, for example? How do I go through strategic skimming to figure out what strategies I need, the same way you just did with the scientific article? When we think about rhetorical reading and writing, we're thinking about how do we make sense of the argument? Who is the audience here? What tools are being used to persuade me or affect my emotions? When we think about social reading, we're really thinking about how do I understand this in the context of my own values, the values of my friends? How do my friends understand this? Maybe if you've ever talked about a book with someone else or talked about an article, that's a lot of social meaning making. And then informational reading and writing. And this is the one we often teach students very early on. It's often included in standardized tests. Read the passage, answer the questions. There's not a lot of room for making connections to the self or for really analyzing the text and how one feels about it. It's about finding information. In combination, when we're scaffolding reading, we're asking students to go through each of these levels, maybe multiple times over. For the purpose of kind of addressing where the research for this comes from, I want to provide you with a couple of sources that you can look up on your own and are included in the study guide. I don't want to belabor them, but I want to sort of point out where they come from because I think it's helpful to think about in terms of that transdisciplinarity that Darren and Aaron were speaking about in the last module. So, genre and generic reading or genre analysis comes from Swales and Baserman and has been largely influenced by the English for academic purposes model of ESL or multilingual learning. Rhetorical reading and writing comes from Bitzer, Flowers, and Hayes, but was really actively a dominant model coming out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in part because people were trying to figure out how to respond to World War II and make sure that we wouldn't repeat the horrors of World War II by establishing the ability for students to analyze text and especially how emotion is being used to make people sometimes not pay attention to the information. Reader response and social annotation starts coming out in the 1980s and 90s with Heath and Rosenblatt, Bartholomew and Prochaska, and continues to be current, for example, in the works of Sub, where we're really asking students to not only make sense of a text and how it connects to themselves, but how it connects them to culture, the world around them, and the other students who are reading and writing that text in the classroom with them. And then informational reading includes some of all of these. Rosenblatt, notably, uh, her efferent reading, for example, is about information gathering. More recently, Weinberg and McGrew, through the Stanford study, have really emphasized the importance of lateral reading, information checking, fact finding when reading, especially online.
So now I'm going to move into supporting multilingual readers. I want to tie in what Brett has said about reading skills to how multilingual students might uniquely face challenges, but also advantages in what they read in standard English. So I want to just start off by outlining some concepts. I'm going to be using multilingual because unlike some other terms like ESL, English as a second language, or English for speakers of other languages, but also you may have heard of L1 and L2 or native speakers of English and non-native speakers. Multilingual, I think, decenters English as the target language for language learners. So instead of focusing on the order in which they learned their languages, um, it refocuses on their linguistic resources and how they inform each other to make meaning. So I'll be using multilingual interchangeably with ESL and ESOL, but with this meaning in mind to refer to students whose first language is something other than English.
At this point, we invite you to again pause and reflect. Whether you're thinking about what you just heard on your own or you're pausing a moment to discuss with colleagues. What are some aspects of a language that can make reading and learning in a different language difficult for someone?
So when you were thinking of potential answers to that question, I do want you to think about if you are quote unquote monolingual and you don't know a language outside of English, to keep in mind that standard English is everyone's second language, right? We're not raised within standard English and the language that we hear in the academy. So that is one way to consider how you might speak multiple languages, even if you don't speak a language outside of English. But a couple of these answers might be some of the ones that you came up with. So we're just going to go through a list of them. The first one would be figures of speech. Figures of speech indicate cultural values and perspectives. So, this is something that might be hard to pick up for someone who was not raised in a particular culture. For instance, the symbol of a watch, if I translate it, in English, it runs. In Spanish, it might walk. In German, it functions. And in French, it marches. If we look at how idioms describe time in the Western context, we see that time flies, time is money, wasting time, running out of time, right? And these are just a few of the examples. But from these examples, we see that we think of time as a commodity, as something that we need to use sparingly and really wisely. And we compare it to money. So it's a currency as well. Couple of additional aspects of language that might be confusing for a new language learner might include culturally specific references, language that assumes shared points of view and experiences, language that assumes previous and common knowledge, and also value judgments. So, under culturally specific references, we might hear pop culture references, idioms that refer to sports, and also holidays. So, for instance, pop culture, it could include references to movies, TV, music, sports. If you think about certain cultures, how they might have like a national sport in a Western context, it might be football and baseball, but maybe not so much in other cultures. And holidays, think about like the holidays that we really uphold in American culture. So, Christmas, Independence Day. So, these things, knowing the references that are associated with these things and the practices may not be inherent for multilingual students. Also, language that assumes shared points of view and experiences. Right. So we develop our values and belief systems within the context that we are raised. So this has to do with ways of living and meaning making. This might differ depending on the context in which someone grew up. Also, language that assumes previous and common knowledge. So, language that assumes that you know academic English. So, again, it's the second language probably of all of us. But for those who have had an education in the American culture and context, they may feel more confident and familiar with academic English than those new to it. So they may be more familiar with that, but also ways to organize an argument, how to cite sources. So in Western contexts, we often teach the Aristotelian way of arguing, this linear way of arguing. We have a thesis and we develop it. In other cultures, it's less so. So something that they need to learn in addition to learning how to read and write in English and value judgments. So, thinking about how we phrase certain things to describe communities. Culturally deprived, for instance, could be rephrased to culturally dispossessed. Economically disadvantaged could be rephrased to economically exploited. So, having more to do with what has happened to a community rather than assuming that these are inherent characteristics.
Before moving on to the next guided activity, please pause the video to open the document titled CATW Hype Passage, which can be found at the end of the participant handout or in the online ancillary materials for this module. This document will be used for the remainder of the recording. Take 3 minutes to review before proceeding with the video.
Now I want to move on to an activity that is based on the CAT-W, which is the CUNY Assessment Test in Writing. So this is a placement exam that was recently actually terminated, but it was used for a good chunk of CUNY's history. So CUNY is the City University of New York, and the CAT-W was used to place incoming freshmen into their first year writing classes. And this was for um, quote unquote native English speakers as well as non native English speakers. And this particular excerpt that you'll see is from 2012. But I want us to look at it and think about how might a multilingual student respond to this.
So, on your first read of this document that Charissa has just introduced, I want to have you do what we call pre reading or reading for genre and gist. You're not looking at the specific words in the document. You're not trying to make a lot of sense out of it. You're trying to figure out what kind of a document is this and what tools do I need to bring to read the document. I think of pre reading as speed dating the text, not deep reading. You're looking for headings, bold print, questions, images. You're asking, what kind of a text is this? You're trying to identify the convention and the genre. You're asking, what do I already know about this text? And what do I expect to learn or gain? You're asking, what strategies do I bring to approach this text? I'll look over at the text here for a moment and show you what I mean by pre reading this text. When I pre-read this text and I have the context that Charissa has already provided, so that's been very helpful, I know that this is a writing prompt. It says assessment test in writing. But then when I look at it, I also get these other directions. I have assignment, begin by reading the passage below. If I don't have a lot of experience for a text, I might then just start reading the passage below. But interestingly, the writing directions come all the way at the bottom. And if I don't do a pre reading of that to see where the writing directions are, I might miss it. If I'm not familiar with that genre, if this isn't how I've encountered writing assessments in the past, this might also be really confusing for me. Now, Charissa is going to talk through some of the ways that we read a text once we've finished pre reading and skimming it so that we can really get to know a text and annotate it. I will say before passing it over, when I ask my students to pre read, I often ask them, what do they think they're going to learn that they haven't learned before? And then to kind of look for it as they're reading. But that's not the only way to read. There's a lot of other ways we can read.
At this point, I want us to pause and reflect. So, based on the list of language factors that I went over earlier about certain aspects of language that might be alienating to multilingual students, I want us to ask ourselves, what might multilingual students in your classrooms find potentially alienating or confusing in this text? And also explain which passages you revised, your revisions, and the rationale behind these revisions. So feel free to do this in groups, take some time to do it on your own, or we could think about these questions as we are working on it together.
For those of you who are staying with us, uh, Emily and Charissa, can you identify some of the things that you think your students would find um, confusing or alienating in this text?
I think right off the bat, we might see figurative language, mental pollutants. So for someone who is looking literally at pollutants, they might question, how can we be polluted mentally? So that might be a little confusing.
One of the things I'm also thinking about if I were to review a text like this and an assignment like this with my students would be what their purpose is for reading the text. And like you had noted earlier, Brett, we get told to begin reading the passage below, but we're told that this is an assessment in writing. So, what are we supposed to do with the reading? I'm not sure as a reader yet why I need to engage with this text or how.
I think a similar thing as to add to mental pollutants would be commercial pollution. So not something necessarily you would see literally. So they might not understand, how can you be polluted with commercials? Another thing is the assumption of a shared way of life, a shared kind of perspective, to assume that everyone might encounter um, 12 billion display ads every day, 3 million radio commercials, right? This many commercials um, is probably not accurate. So, students, even within the United States, who were raised in more rural communities, may not be exposed to such a commercial way of life, but also students who were raised abroad may have a less capitalistic mindset or way of looking at the world, Maybe they are not encountering so many commercials. Maybe they don't watch TV as much. So this assumes that they have this shared experience. And if they don't, they have to kind of put themselves in the shoes of someone who does, which is this extra layer of labor that they would have to do. Also, collective unconscious, that's a phrase that they might be unfamiliar with.
I love all these comments. So I'll say that when I am in my classroom reading a document with my students, before I send them home with the first couple of readings, we'll do this kind of annotation. And part of what we're doing is looking for words they don't know, phrases they don't know, um, and these kinds of assumptions, which I find my students are actually really good at identifying and saying, "Hey, I'm from Mexico, and we actually don't have this thing or this phrase. In Spanish, we say it this way." So these are great annotations. Any others?
I would encourage students to go down to the bottom as well and to annotate the assignment information. So if we take a minute to look over the writing directions, we're told that we should read the passage and write an essay responding to the ideas it presents. So I might then encourage my students to think about what those main ideas are that they're supposed to be identifying from this passage above. What didn't we understand based on vocabulary or context that is preventing us from understanding or identifying those ideas so that we can figure out what the ideas are that are being presented so then we can figure out how we want to respond to them. And what does that mean as a writer to respond? Am I supposed to be creating some sort of an argument? Am I supposed to be agreeing, disagreeing, expanding upon? What is it that the assessor is looking for in this text?
That's a really good point, Emily. I'm also noticing in this text. So we know that readers tend to focus at the beginnings of sentences for the most important content and the ends of sentences for new ideas. That's something we know from the research. This one has read a passage and write an essay, but notice write an essay is in the middle. It's the least likely part of a sentence to get read. And then we have in your essay, be sure to summarize the passage. Okay, so one of my jobs is to summarize in my own words, right? And then state the author's most important ideas. Okay, develop my essay by identifying one passage that seems especially significant. What, as a reader, I'm thinking, what does it mean to develop and what makes a passage significant? And explain. Well, am I supposed to summarize or am I supposed to develop or am I supposed to explain? I have to explain it too. That's a really complex set of instructions to put into one sentence, right? We're really putting a lot of cognitive load on that sentence. And then we get additional instructions below it. Yeah.
I think this is another place to teach students that when we read instructions, we don't necessarily have to follow them linearly, even though they're outlined as read it first, but to look through it all. What can I look for critically? How can I read critically as I'm reading so that I'm not just reading without any kind of purpose?
hmm Yeah. I think that's a good point. Um, do you ever have I'm curious for you and also participants watching, do you ever have your students rewrite instructions in a different format for themselves? Like making a checklist or a comic strip or something like that?
In my ESL classes and in my developmental literacy classes, we do checklists, right? So, what are the tasks that we're being asked to do? And we'll usually identify those through annotations like this, and then we'll number them or we'll reorder them as necessary, right? So, what am I being asked to do
hmm
in this task? What do I need to know or understand in order to perform the task, right? And then we can transition into, pre-writing or some sort of a series of activities to allow us to complete the task.
As we see in a later slide, like I often ask my students to quote unquote translate certain terms. So how can we like simplify certain instructions that might be jargon or very academic ease? Like what is this really saying? So that's something I might ask them to annotate. Like, well, what does it mean to?
I'm
Oh,
just moving
sorry.
up the text.
Oh, oh, I meant more the instructions. But yeah, like how can we simplify an instruction so that it's more accessible. And oftentimes I'll also distill that into a rubric just so that they can like see it laid out like that and think about it in a more objective way.
I like that. I like that a lot. Thank you, Charissa. So you might have them, what does it mean to support your claims with evidence and have them maybe rewrite that in their own words or even languages.
And then just to look at that second paragraph, it suddenly shifts to the second person. That could be a little jarring for a multilingual student. But then you see that it's chock full of pop culture references. Pepsi, Snickers, video carts, which I don't know what that is. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Oscar Mayer Wiener song. So a lot of these, again, assume prior knowledge. They assume that these students are familiar with these brands or have watched these commercials, are familiar with the song. And that's just not true. So again, it's this extra layer of labor where these students have to put themselves in the shoes of someone who does know these references. They have to fill in the blanks before they can even read it and make sense of it, and before they can even write about it.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to go back, bring us back to the slides now. I'll encourage those of you who are participating, if you're doing this as a professional workshop or on your own, that you continue to annotate this document, looking for some of those same questions as we add more ways that you can annotate. Another way to do this is with any other document that you might bring into your classroom for students uh, uh, when they're reading a new document for the first time. But let's get back to the slides. After pre reading, we move into reading. We've already done this seamlessly as a group as we've gone through and started annotating some of the words and phrases that might seem uncomfortable, that might be laden with not only popular culture, but outdated popular cultural references or phrases, terminology, and directions that don't entirely or immediately make sense or are written in ways that are not as helpful to the reader as they could be. Typically, when we think of reading, we're thinking of vertical reading, which is within text. That's what we've just done. We make annotations to reinforce meaning by drawing connections to ourselves, other texts, the world. We look for arguments and evidence. That's rhetorical reading. We ask, how does this text impact me? That kind of social meaning. What is this text asking me to do within my community, which is both informational and social? We may also do lateral reading, and while we don't have time to model that here, I want to reinforce that lateral reading validates information across texts. It's a really important aspect of reading now because we're often asking students to read things that are online. And so lateral reading encourages students to go off the page to identify the author of cited text and to evaluate the credibility and additional meanings of texts, both in terms of the information and the rhetorical approaches. These are some other ways that we might annotate.
So, like I mentioned earlier, we might translate idioms or vocabulary that might be really specific to a culture or just in academia to simplify it and understand what they mean. In the case of translating idioms, it might take a little bit more unpacking. So, connecting it to its cultural significance, explaining a little bit about why baseball matters in a particular culture, or what Christmas means in a particular culture. We might also pose questions to the author. So I always ask my students to think about themselves in conversation with the author, not having to defer or take at face value what the author is saying. But if you were in a conversation, what questions might you ask? You might also want to ask students to push back or read against the grain. So they might ask the author when they're in conversation with the author if they might disagree with something, if they have a gap in the argument that they've spotted. Is there something that they can challenge the author on? They might also make connections to other texts. So thinking about other texts that they have read in previous classes or in that class, are there any overlaps? We teach synthesis. So how do we put this text in conversation with another text? And they might also make connections to their own experiences. And I think that this is valuable because they get to look at their own experiences as these valid texts in and of themselves that they can put in conversation with what they read.
So once we've had this opportunity to maybe model annotating for our students, bring those social annotations into the classroom where multiple students nominate or promote ideas that they want to have annotated in a group text. We can also then ask them to walk away and reflect on their learning. And this is where the meat actually really comes into the lesson. I sometimes have students who sort of sit back and watch everybody annotate, um, but then they need to go and think about what those annotations meant for them. And even if they didn't contribute ideas to the annotation process, they then go back and look at those annotations made by the other students in class. And they have an opportunity to think about what they learned or what it means to them going forward. So, metacognition looks at personalizing the learning, improving comprehension and recall. Metacognitive reflection asks us to reflect on what we have learned directly or by connecting with it in a new way. Some of the ways we might frame some metacognitive reflection is by asking questions like, how has my understanding changed? Earlier, I noted that with pre reading, I sometimes ask students before they read an assignment to just briefly write for me what they think they're going to learn or how they think their thinking will change. Then I have them come back later and say, how did your understanding change? And if it didn't change at all, well, maybe you read something you already agreed with. But sometimes they say, oh, I didn't expect this part. What assumptions of mine are challenged? Did anything that I believed prior to this text or the values that I bring to this text, were they challenged by the position of the author? And then I really like this one. I think it really helps students synthesize their reading and make sense of it. I say, what did the author not explain? What did they leave out that you think they should have included? It forces them to kind of go through and, in a compact way, explain to themselves what was there so they can identify what's not there. With these ideas in mind, I want to have you go back to the study guide and think about what questions you might ask yourself or your students after this reading. How might you frame a pre reading, reading, and then metacognitive reflection around a reading that you're already doing in class? Or if you're already doing two of these steps, is there a way you could add a third step to the process? Here, we'd like to have you pause and go to the study guide and think through some of those questions.
Welcome back. I hope that your discussion was as fruitful as the exercises that we were able to do with our presenters today. I want to take a moment to thank once again Dr. Charissa and Dr. Brett Griffiths, as well as Essentium, our funder, and the Texas Success Center, Student Ready Strategies, and SESI, who partnered with West Ed in order to present this, our second of 4 professional seminars for supporting multilingual learners transitioning into college. Thank you very much. Today's professional development module is a part of Translating Opportunity Texas, which is a collaborative initiative among the Texas Success Center, Student Ready Strategies, West Ed, and the Center for Community College Student Engagement. The initiative is funded by Ascendium Education Philanthropy, a division of Ascendium Education Group. Copyright 2025, permission granted for unlimited use with appropriate citation.